I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 14.5 as America mobilizes on the home front. It's a period of time where Americans, whether or not you were serving in the military or not, men, women, children, seniors, all had roles to play within American society. The key objectives here that we'll focus in on: examine how the need to support the war effort changed American lives, analyze the impact the war had on civil liberties for Japanese American citizens and others. We'll look at how World War II increased opportunities for women, minorities. We'll describe how World War II caused migration within the United States and its impact on migration itself. So keep in mind, you should fill out your responses as we go through this. If you need to pause at some point in time to get some information down, feel free to do so. All right, question one: how did American involvement in World War II influence the Depression? The American mobilization, the changeover from butter to guns, producing weapons for the war, effectively ended the Great Depression. 19 million new jobs. Many factories were operating 24 hours a day, either 2 12-hour shifts. If they didn't have enough workers, if they had enough workers, they would have somewhere around 3 8-hour shifts. And sometimes people would work double shifts. As far as income is concerned, the average American family's income nearly doubled during this period of time. There are many ways for Americans to get involved on the home front. You could buy a war bond. A war bond works where, let's say, for example, you bought a $50 bond. It would cost you $25 in 1941 or 1942. And then it might have a maturity rate of 10 or 15 years on it. So let's say 10 years down the road, that $25 bond or the $50 bond that you bought for $25 would be matured to $50. That's the basic premise of bonds today. You could buy a savings bond today, although bond rates are down. You buy a $50 bond for, let's say, $25 today, and it might take 20 years for it to finally be worth $50, but it does mature at its full rate at some point in time. Americans in general accepted higher taxes. They began rationing things like food and gasoline. Something simple you could do on the home front is you could plant a victory garden, if it's a tomato crop or cucumber or whatever it might be. And whatever you can get for your own home can save on the food that you might have to purchase at the grocery store. People carpooled, meaning they shared a car to go to work or whatever it might be. Recycling became popular, especially big metals and things like that. Retirees, women, and minorities worked in factories, so people who might not have been regularly working prior to World War II are now working regularly during the war. Next, we'll look at this little graph here to help us understand question number 3. Using the graph, America pays for war. What effect did spending during the war have on the national debt? Well, the national debt was more than 100% of the total GDP in 1945, 6, and 7, meaning the government was engaging in deficit spending in order to fund the war. The war eventually cost $330 billion. In 6 years, the national debt increased from $42 to $269 billion. To help pay for the war, Congress levied a 5% tax on all working Americans. So during World War II, rather than complaining about high taxes, which most Americans do today, they kind of took a deep breath and said, okay, this is for a very important reason. They rationalized the reason behind the higher taxes, and they willingly paid the higher tax rate. Too often in modern day society, Americans do not make sacrifices in many different ways, not just in terms of supporting a war, but a lot of times they're unwilling to do what is necessary to help out. And that's not us as individuals, but collectively as a society. 4, explain why the Office of the Price Administration was established. The government agency created to deal with the shortage or the clarkage of consumer goods during the war. In order to halt inflation as the demand for goods far outweighed the supply, the OPA put limits on prices for almost all products. So what the real purpose of the OPA was to make sure that you weren't getting price gouged. Obviously, there were shortages of a wide variety of products, and let's say you're a store that has the last few left. Well, naturally, you could probably raise that price significantly, and eventually someone will come in to pay for that, the price for that item, the inflated price. But We wanted to make sure that citizens were not being gouged at the stores. Five, the Office of Price Administration began the policy of rationing. Let's just clarify what rationing actually is. It's when you limit the amount of scarce goods that each person can buy to ensure fair distribution. Ration boards actually gave out ration stamps during this period of time, which were basically like a coupon booklet that allowed you to buy a certain number of items. Let's say 1 pound of sugar, 2 pounds of coffee, 5 pounds of red meat, 50 gallons of gas per month, and other things like shoes. Shoes were in short supply because of the leather shortage. Rationing is something too that you might remember. You guys are kind of young, but during difficult times, even in New Jersey after Superstorm Sandy, they actually rationed gasoline. Every other day you could buy gasoline, and you would limit it, let's just say 10 gallons per purchase. They based it on your license plate, so if your license plate ended in an even number, you can get gas on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. If it was an odd number, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturdays, and then maybe Sunday, everybody could wait in line. During this period of time, too, Americans began to cut back on cloth. Skirts were made shorter and without pleats. Men's suits tailored without pockets and cuffs. Citizens were encouraged to donate old clothes or purchase previously worn clothing at thrift shops. Even your everyday pop culture items, things like a comic book here. These are some of your DC heroes: Robin, the Boy Wonder, the Cape Crusader, Batman, the Man of Steel, Superman, all seen here working together, pitching in their own victory gardens. So the dual purpose of a victory garden is, one, to promote the idea that every American can help out in the war effort, even if it was just a small garden at home to grow a vegetable or two, and nicknamed victory gardens for the broad goal, the long-term goal of victory in the war. Eight, explain the Office of War Information. This is basically a propaganda office to coordinate efforts in the United States to continue to encourage American citizens to pitch in and stay positive during the war effort. Posters, public service announcements, newsreels all promoted the war effort. So basically, we got a unified country from the top down, from the president down to each and every individual citizen. Unlike today with the polarization of politics, with the country roughly divided 50-50 on a wide variety of political issues. We're pretty much uniform or united here on the war effort, and part of that was through coordination of the government. Now, of course, you as an individual can argue the merits of whether or not the government should take on the role of being an instrument of propaganda, but us as individuals can make up our own minds regardless of what we hear from any media outlet or the government. Next, we're going to start looking at some of the issues that Japanese were facing during this time. 9, why do the Japanese Americans growing up in California face prejudice prior even to the Pearl Harbor bombing? Well, growing up, they face racial bias, discrimination, all while growing up in California during, let's say, the 1920s and 30s. We had a situation, too, during the Great Depression. There's a lot of resentment towards any immigrant group in our country as there's a lot of competition for jobs. A lot of the Japanese Americans faced prejudice during that period of time in California and along the West Coast. 10, how did Americans living along the West Coast react to the bombing at Pearl Harbor? The bombing at Pearl Harbor created mass hysteria, chaos, and craziness along the West Coast. There was a lot of false rumors spreading that the Japanese American citizens were agents of the Japanese military and government, that they were going to wear trench coats and detonate bombs in public places, and that the Japanese citizens, in many people's eyes, including military leadership, they were all enemies of our country. Hours after the attack at Pearl Harbor, there were additional rumors that the Japanese fleet was quickly approaching California. The United States was unprepared for such an attack. Fortunately, it never occurred along the West Coast. But you'll see here these banners and posters and signs, a lot of prejudice and racist stuff pop up all along the West Coast. Japanese American citizens were referenced with a derogatory term of Japs. And you can see the sign there, Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Here's the Liberty Calf. No Japs served here. So really, an unfortunate period of time in American history, at least in this particular event, and the treatment of Japanese Americans. Keep in mind, these aren't illegal immigrants. These are Japanese American citizens, people who have the same equal rights as any of us within society. As I alluded to a moment ago, how do you think the U.S. military leaders viewed Japanese Americans? They saw no distinction between the Japanese in Japan and Japanese American citizens in the United States. They were all members of the enemy race. There were rumors abound that the Japanese Americans were going to strap bombs, as I mentioned before, going to stores, schools, restaurants, blow up and kill people, basically like suicide bombers. Okay, moving on to 12, how did Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 impact Japanese Americans? FDR issued this executive order authorizing the military officials to exclude any and all persons of Japanese descent from areas designated military zones. So basically, under this order, all Japanese along the West Coast, including those who were citizens of the United States of Japanese descent, were evacuated and placed in internment camps. And you can see the sign there. That's basically something that appeared instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. That was posted in post offices, on telephone poles, all across the towns. Japanese had a warning that they were going to be rounded up. They were told to bring with them. There's a list on there. You can't really see it in that image, but a list of certain items they'd have to bring, like linens and blankets and things like that, clothing, silverware. How many Americans of Japanese descent were forced into internment camps? Well over 100,000. Some say as high as 120,000, depending upon the outlet you look at, historically speaking. Where were the camps? What were the conditions of the camps like? They were scattered across California, usually in the desert areas and the Arkansas swamps. In general, the camps had barbed wire surrounding the area. They were guarded. They didn't look all that different than what a concentration camp would look like in Nazi Germany and throughout Poland. These camps were, the small barracks there, those kind of long areas where they would live. That would be their living quarters. You would have the barbed wire fencing. You could see the photograph on the right. That's a train that's coming in. They're basically transporting the Japanese to that location, that camp. Conditions or cots were very hard, poor conditions. Those in the Arizona desert were so extremely hot, they had to deal with snakes and scorpions and other issues. And of course, the Japanese citizens felt like prisoners in their own country. The Japanese Americans were put in internment camps, but Italian Americans and German Americans were not. Why was this the case? Well, the most significant factor was racism. Japanese Americans did not have as much power or representation in the U.S. government. And after the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Americans had a sense of fear about Japanese spies and a much more hatred towards the Japanese. Ted Nakashima was quoted here in the New Republic in June of 1942, shortly after being put into an internment camp. He said, what really hurts is being called Japs. Japs are the guys we are fighting. So basically, Ted Nakashima is 100% loyal to the United States. He is opposed to the Japanese military that we're fighting against, but unfortunately for him, he's put into an internment camp. So according to his quote, Japanese Americans lost their rights as American citizens. They lost their homes, their livelihoods, lived in what was actually a jail, uncomfortable quarters for several years during the war. And there's the quote there that I mentioned. 17, many American women had worked outside the home before World War II. What was different about women working during the war? Well, women had worked during the war, worked in heavy industrial jobs. These were traditionally male dominated. So women had worked in, I guess for that period of time, more traditional jobs. A lot of them were teachers and things like that. Nurses, now they were actually serving heavy duty, moving around equipment and working in the factories. Married women and older women worked outside the home sometimes for the first time. The imagery there, we can do it. You can see a strong, stern expression from Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter became symbolic of the tough and rough, equal female during this period of time, women who were proving themselves to be as good or better than men in regard to performing many different tasks or duties. Posters like this showed her determination. It boosted the morale of women and kind of pushed forward women's rights during this period of time. More and more women became confident. They began taking on more and more tasks and jobs. They were earning money outside the home. One woman said, "I decided that if I could learn to weld like a man, I could do anything it took to make a living." So it was more of a sense of independence too for women. Unfortunately, what happened to working women after the war? After the war, women lost many of those same jobs. As the men returned home from the battlefield, they were able to get their jobs back. So women who were hired out of necessity were losing their jobs in deference to men. However, the female population of white-collar workers continued to rise, and they continued to move forward over the decades as more and more women took on jobs outside the home. 20 had an executive order 8802 falls short in meeting Philip Randolph's demands. Both promised fair hiring practices only for African Americans in government-funded industries. Other employers in the country were not bound by it, so it was a limited step forward for African Americans, but not full or across the board equality for African Americans in employment. The last little section here is on migration during the war. 21, why do farmers experience labor shortages during the war? What do people do about these shortages? Farmers experienced shortages because so many people moved away from the farms to fill wartime factory jobs in the South and the West, plus many soldiers were fighting overseas. Others had already fled farming communities because of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl. At the same time, demand rose because Europe and the soldiers overseas needed food. Farmers used other workers, including teenagers, prisoners of war, Mexican immigrants, in the Brasilia program to fill these shortages. We also used better technology to grow more food. 22, how are the causes of the Detroit race riots and the Los Angeles Zoot Suit riots similar? Both were in overcrowded cities because so many people had migrated there looking for more jobs. This competition for jobs, housing, and racial prejudice all sparked these riots. And finally, the lesson reflection question, how did World War II impact equality in America? African Americans saw, as we mentioned not too long ago, increased employment and job opportunities. Also, African Americans were working for the first time side by side with white America. Women worked in male-dominated jobs, and other ethnic groups stepped up during the war. Take a moment or two to get down anything you need. So this will conclude our discussion of Americans stepping up and the effort on the home front during World War II. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.